6 years ago, I was folding napkins into swans for tips at a hotel restaurant in Charleston. Tonight, I was going to end an empire in front of 300 people wearing borrowed diamonds. Nobody in that ballroom knew that yet, least of all my husband. The Choi Group's 10th anniversary gala was supposed to be simple. Smile, greet the board, stand next to J1 while he shook hands and let old men call him the future. I'd done it every year since we married. I was good at it. I'd been trained for it my whole adult life, first as a waitress carrying trays through rooms exactly like this one, learning which forks mattered and which men didn't. I was standing near the champagne fountain in a navy gown, the sapphire pin J1's grandmother once called a nice touch for someone in your position, clipped to my shoulder when the doors opened and the room went quiet in that specific way rooms go quiet right before something ugly happens. J1 walked in with his hand resting on the small of a woman's back. Se-yeon Baek, 26, the event director from Choi Group's PR division, in a red dress that did nothing to hide the round curve of her stomach. He didn't look for me first. That was the detail that told me everything. 6 years of marriage, and his eyes went to the room before they went to his wife. "Everyone," he said, lifting his glass like he was announcing a merger instead of detonating one. "I want you to meet someone important to me. Se-yeon is carrying my child." The silence had a sound. I've never been able to describe it better than that. His grandmother, Sua Choi, sat at the head table in emerald silk, and she did not gasp. She nodded, slowly, like she'd been briefed. I set my glass down before my hand could shake and give them the satisfaction. "J1!" My voice came out even. I'd learned that trick a long time ago, in rooms with much worse men than him. "You want to explain that to me now? Or should I guess?" He had the nerve to look almost bored. "Naomi, don't make a scene. I haven't made one yet." Se-yeon smiled at me, one hand resting on her belly like a prop she'd rehearsed with. "I know this is difficult, but some things are bigger than a marriage, don't you think? Legacy, family, a name that continues." A ripple of laughter went through the closest tables. Not loud, just enough for me to hear it. Grandmother Choi rose, smoothed her skirt, and looked at me the way she'd looked at me since the day J1 brought me home. Like I was a stain she was still deciding how to remove. "Naomi," she said, "perhaps you should help in the back tonight. The catering staff could use direction. You know that world so well." More laughter. Not a ripple this time, a wave. An older board member near the front, a man named Winston Hale, who'd shaken my hand at every gala for 6 years without once asking my name twice, chuckled into his drink and murmured something to his wife that ended in the word waitress. A young server near the kitchen doors, a girl who couldn't have been more than 19, caught my eye across the room. She didn't laugh. She looked at me the way I used to look at the women who came through those same doors years ago, wondering which ones would let a room like this decide who they were. A society columnist named Diane Marsh, seated 2 tables away, leaned toward her dinner companion and said, just loud enough, "I always wondered how long it would take for J1 to trade up. You can only dress a woman a certain way before people stop pretending not to notice where she came from." Her companion laughed into a napkin. "I want you to sit with that for a second," because I did. I stood in the middle of the room I'd hosted 100 times, in a dress worth more than my first year's rent, and the head of the family that married me told 300 guests that my proper place was back in the kitchen. 6 years earlier, that would have broken me. That night, in that dress, with that pin on my shoulder, it did something else instead. It reminded me exactly who I was, and exactly what I'd built while everyone in that room assumed I'd built nothing at all. I thought, for just a second, about a night 11 years ago, a different ballroom, a different city, when I was the one carrying the tray. I was 23, working a fundraiser at a hotel in Charleston, 3 tables deep into a shift that had already run 2 hours long, when a retired investment manager named Harold Weiss stopped me on my way past his table. He wasn't looking for another drink. He was frowning at the financial trade paper folded under his elbow, and without really thinking about who I was or wasn't supposed to be, I said, "That number's wrong, by the way. They're using last quarter's shipping index instead of this quarter's. It changes the whole projection." He looked up at me like I'd spoken a foreign language fluently by accident. "Excuse me?" "I'm sorry," I said, already regretting it, already bracing for the version of this conversation where a man like him reminded a woman like me exactly what my job was. I read a lot on my breaks. He didn't say anything else that night. He came back the next week, asked for me by section instead of by name, and spent 40 minutes asking me questions about markets I had no business knowing as well as I did, testing me the way people test something they're not sure they believe yet. I answered every one of them. 6 months later, he handed me a check for $40,000 across a different table in a different restaurant and said, "Prove me right, Miss Calloway. I don't make this offer twice." I didn't sleep for a week after that. I turned $40,000 into $90,000 within a year, trading on nothing but the same instinct that told me the shipping index was wrong the night we met. 2 years after that, Calloway Crown Capital existed on paper, with exactly one client and one employee, both of them me. It took 6 more years of nights that looked nothing like galas and everything like spreadsheets at 2 in the morning before it became the fund standing behind $3 billion of other people's money. Nobody in that ballroom, tonight, had ever bothered to ask me a single real question in 6 years of marriage. A stranger who barely knew my name had handed me the beginning of an empire because he did. If you've ever been underestimated by people who had no idea who they were talking to, tell me where you're watching this from right now. I want to know how many of us there are. I picked my glass back up. I didn't leave. I smiled, because that's the one thing none of them expected, and I said, "I think I'll stay right here, actually. I wouldn't miss tonight for anything." Jaewon's jaw tightened. He hated when I didn't perform the reaction he'd scripted for me. Siyon's smile faltered for exactly 1 second before she caught it. 1 second was enough. I'd spent 6 years learning to read faces in rooms where a wrong read cost people money. Hers told me she wasn't just here for a scandal. She was here for something bigger, and Jaewon had no idea he was a prop in his own affair. The MC, a nervous Choi Group junior exec named Priya, tapped the microphone at the front of the ballroom. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention." We'll now move to tonight's main event, the signing of the strategic partnership between Choi Group and Holden Pacific, which will define the company's next decade. Jaewon straightened his jacket, already walking toward the stage, already smiling the smile he wore for cameras. Siyon trailed a step behind him, hands still on her stomach, playing wife-in-waiting for a crowd that hadn't finished laughing at the real one. I let him get halfway to the podium before I moved. "I want you to understand something about me before I go further, because it matters for everything that happens next. I did not marry into money. I built the reason there still was money. 6 years ago, Choi Group was 90 days from bankruptcy. A shipping route dispute, a bad loan, a board too proud to admit the company their grandfather built was sinking. I know that because my firm, Calloway Crown Capital, was the one that wrote the rescue check. Not Jaewon, not his grandmother, me. Before I ever wore his last name, before anyone in that family knew my face, they knew my signature on a term sheet that kept their lights on. $240 million, wired in 11 days, at a time when 3 other funds had already walked away from the deal, calling it unsalvageable. I never told them who signed it. Jaewon courted me 2 years later at a benefit dinner, having no idea the woman he was flirting with was the same Calloway who'd quietly kept his family's name off the bankruptcy filings. I let it stay that way, partly because I liked watching him fall for me without an agenda attached, partly because I'd learned, long before I met any of them, that the people who show you their whole hand too early get played by everyone else at the table. Priya's voice rang out again. "Mr. Choi, whenever you're ready." I walked toward the stage. Not fast, not slow. The exact pace I use when I want a room to notice me without asking permission to. "Actually," I said, loud enough to carry, "I'll be signing tonight." Jaewon laughed, the short, dismissive laugh he used whenever he thought I'd said something cute and slightly foolish. "Naomi, sweetheart, this isn't the time. It's exactly the time." I reached the podium. Priya looked at me, then at the folder in her hands, then at me again, clearly unsure whose authority outranked whose in this specific, catastrophic moment. "Give her the folder, Priya," I said gently. She did. Sometimes the people with the least power in a room are the ones paying the closest attention, and they know exactly who to listen to when it counts. I opened it. The partnership agreement sat on top, Jaewon's signature line waiting at the bottom, right next to a line that had always, quietly, required a second signature. His grandmother had never asked whose. I doubt she'd ever actually read the document at all. Holden Pacific's deal isn't with Choi Group, I said, turning so the room could hear every word. It's with Choi Group's primary capital partner, who holds contractual approval rights over any deal above $200 million. That partner is Calloway Crown Capital. A murmur went through the crowd, the kind of murmur that means people are recalculating who they're afraid of. And Calloway Crown Capital, I continued, is mine. I founded it. I've run it for 11 years. It manages just under $3 billion for pension funds and family offices across 2 continents. 6 years ago, it kept this family's company from disappearing entirely, and every major deal Choi Group has signed since then needed my signature to become real, including, as it happens, tonight's. If you're watching this and you've ever had someone decide you were small right before you showed them exactly how large you actually were, comment the word "reveal" below. I want to see how many of you know that feeling. Jaewon's face had gone the color of the tablecloths. That's not possible. I work in capital markets, Jaewon. I have for 11 years. You met me at a benefit dinner and decided I was a woman who used to wait tables, so that's all I ever was to you. It never once occurred to you to ask what I did after I stopped waiting tables. You never asked. Not once in 6 years. Si-yeon's hand had gone still on her stomach. I watched her eyes cut, fast, toward the back of the room, toward a table where Do-hyun Choi sat with his arms crossed, watching everything unfold with the calm of a man who already knew how tonight would go. That was the second thing that told me this wasn't just an affair. This was a plan, and Se-yeon wasn't the one who'd built it. Grandmother Choi stood, silk rustling. Naomi, this is a family celebration. Whatever business arrangement you claim to have, surely it can wait until... It can't, I said, because I'm not here to save this company again for free. Not after tonight. I turned to Priya. Move the signing table forward, please. I'll be taking Jaewon's place at the signing. The room didn't laugh this time. Holden Pacific's representative, a silver-haired man named Robert Sung, who I'd worked with on 2 other deals under my own name, walked toward the podium with visible relief on his face, like a man who'd just realized the adult in the room had finally shown up. Miss Calloway, he said, extending his hand. It's good to actually meet you in person. I've read your fund's numbers for years. Didn't realize you were connected to tonight's host family. Neither did they, apparently, I said. That got a laugh. A real one, warm, from somewhere near the back. It spread, and just like that, the room's temperature changed, and I watched 300 people quietly, silently, begin recalculating exactly who deserved their respect tonight. I signed the document. My name, in full, under the line that had always been there, waiting, unnoticed, for 6 years. Calloway, not Choi. Jaewon stood frozen at the edge of the stage, Se-yeon's hand no longer on his arm, no longer performing devotion, because she had already started looking for her exit. You did this on purpose, he said to me, quiet enough that only I could hear it. You let everyone think you were just my wife. I let you think that, I said. The rest of the world knew exactly who I was. You're the only person in this building who never bothered to find out. He grabbed my wrist. Not hard. Just enough to remind me he still thought he was allowed to. I looked down at his hand until he let go. You brought your pregnant mistress to my company's gala, I said, low, steady, for his ears only. You wanted to humiliate me in front of everyone who matters to you, so I did the only fair thing. I replaced you in front of everyone who matters to me. I walked off that stage with the signed agreement in my hand and my composure fully intact, and behind me, I could already hear the whispers starting, the kind that would be in every business paper in the city by morning. Not about an affair, about who actually ran Choi Group and how long she'd let everyone believe otherwise. I want to tell you it ended there. It didn't. It was only the beginning of the worst week of Jaewon Choi's life, and I intended to be present for every single day of it. By the time I got home that night, my phone had 41 messages. Board members. Reporters. Marcus, my QO, and the only person besides my lawyer who'd known my marriage was a mess for at least a year before tonight. His text just said, "Heard what happened. Proud of you. Also, the board's calling an emergency session tomorrow. You'll want to be there before Jaewon's people spin it. I didn't sleep that night, but not because I was falling apart, because I was already building the next move. Grandmother Choi called me at 7 the next morning. No apology in her voice, just business, the tone she reserved for people she considered dangerous rather than family. "You embarrassed my grandson in front of the entire industry," she said. "He embarrassed himself the moment he decided a pregnant mistress belonged at a company gala," I said. "I just made sure everyone understood who was actually holding this family up while he did it." The board is meeting at 10. Some members are questioning whether Jaewon is fit to continue as heir apparent. "That's not my decision to make," I said. "But considering my firm holds veto rights over any leadership transition, it might be worth including me in that conversation instead of hearing about it from someone else." Silence. Then, quieter. "You've been sitting on this power for 6 years and said nothing." "I've been holding this family's company together for 6 years and said nothing," I corrected her. "There's a difference, and I'd have thought a woman who built an empire herself would recognize it." She hung up. I took that as an invitation. The boardroom at 10 was full in a way I'd never seen it. Every seat taken, phones face down, the air thick with the specific tension that comes right before people decide whose side they're on. Jaewon sat at the head of the table like he still believed that was his seat. Do-hun sat 2 chairs down, quiet, composed, the picture of a man who hadn't spent the last several months quietly building a case against his own cousin. I walked in last. Nobody offered me a seat at the head of the table, so Marcus stood, pulled out the chair directly across from Jaewon, and I took it myself. "Let's not waste the morning," I said. "Everyone here already knows what happened last night. What you don't all know is why." Do-hyun's eyes flicked towards Se-yeon's empty chair. She hadn't come. Smart girl. Or scared one. Se-yeon Baek didn't get pregnant by accident and walk into a company gala on a whim, I continued. She's been on Choi Group's PR payroll for 3 years, reporting to exactly one person outside this family before last night. I set a printed email chain on the table. Marcus had pulled it from the PR division's internal server that morning, the kind of digital paper trail people leave when they think nobody's ever going to look. These are correspondence records between Se-yeon and an outside consulting firm called Ridgeline Strategic. Ridgeline's sole client for the past 8 months has been a shell company called Pacific Compass Holdings. I let that sit. Do-hun's jaw shifted, just slightly. Pacific Compass Holdings is majority owned by Do-hun Choi. The room made a sound I can only describe as a held breath breaking. "Naomi, this is absurd," Do-hun said, too fast. "You're grasping because your husband embarrassed you." "I'm not grasping. I'm reading." Se-yeon's affair with Jaewon wasn't romance, Do-hun. It was leverage. A scandal timed for the anniversary gala. Time to make the board question Jaewon's judgment right before a leadership vote you knew was coming. You didn't need to attack your cousin directly. You just needed him to attack himself, publicly, in front of people who'd remember it. Jaewon looked at Do-hyun like he was seeing him for the first time in his life. "You used her. You used me." "I gave you exactly what you wanted," Do-hun said quietly. "A younger woman who adored you and told you what you needed to hear. I didn't force your hand, cousin. I just gave it something to hold." I turned to the board. "I'm not here to ask you to fire anyone. I'm here to remind you that Calloway Crown Capital holds contractual approval over any executive transition at this company, and I will not approve installing a man who orchestrated a corporate espionage scheme against his own family's leadership, regardless of how this vote is dressed up." Grandmother Choi's face had gone very still. "And Jaewon?" "Jaewon's judgment is his own to answer for," I said. "I have no interest in protecting him from the consequences of his own choices. I do have an interest in this company surviving the next quarter, and it won't if leadership is decided by whoever's affair generated the best headline." Winston Hale, the board member who'd laughed into his drink at the gala the night before, cleared his throat. "With respect, Miss Calloway, this is a family company. There's a difference between financial oversight and installing yourself as the deciding voice on family matters. There's also a difference between a family company and a company a family happens to have their name on," I said. "This stopped being purely a family matter the moment your fiscal survival depended on a lender outside the family. That happened 6 years ago. I've simply chosen not to exercise the leverage that came with it until this week gave me a reason to." A younger board member, a woman named Alina Cho, who'd joined 2 years earlier and had never once, in my presence, treated me as anything less than an equal, spoke up from the far end of the table. For what it's worth, I think the board should have asked these questions about Ridgeline Strategic months ago when the invoicing first looked strange. We didn't, because it was easier not to. That's the pattern I'd like this board to break today, I said. Not just with Do-hun, with every assumption in this room that convenience is the same thing as due diligence. The vote that followed stripped J1 of operational authority pending a full review and blocked Do-hun from any advancement while the espionage claims were investigated by outside counsel. Neither man left that boardroom with what he'd walked in expecting. If you've ever watched someone's whole scheme collapse in real time because they underestimated exactly who was in the room with them, comment your city below. I want to know where all of you are watching this unfold from. That night, after the boardroom emptied and half the staff had already gone home, J1 came to find me in my own office at Calloway Crown Capital, a place he had never once visited in 6 years of marriage. He stood in the doorway like a man who wasn't sure he still had permission to enter rooms. Marcus started to intervene, and I waved him off. "You've never been here," I said. 6 years, and you've never once asked to see where I actually worked. "I know," he said. "I'm not here to make excuses for that." "Then why are you here?" He sat down across from my desk without being invited, which told me more about how far he'd already fallen than anything he could have said out loud. The J1 I married would never have sat before being offered a seat. "I keep replaying it," he said. "The gala. Watching you walk to that podium. I spent 6 years assuming I understood exactly who you were, and I watched you dismantle that assumption in under 4 minutes, in front of everyone whose opinion I've spent my whole life trying to earn. You wanted an explanation," I said. "I don't think I owe you one tonight. I'm not asking for an explanation. I'm asking why you never told me." "Because you never asked," I said. "That's the whole answer, J1. Not some elaborate scheme, not some grand test I set for you. You simply never once, in 6 years, asked your own wife a real question about her life, and I stopped waiting for you to start." He put his head in his hands, and for a moment he looked less like the heir to a shipping empire and more like exactly what he was underneath it. A man who had built his entire identity on being seen a certain way, and had just watched that identity collapse in a single evening. "Seyon!" he started. "I don't want to talk about Seyon tonight." "I wasn't going to defend it," he said. "I was going to say I don't even know why I did it. I think some part of me wanted you to react, to fight for something. You never seemed like you needed anything from me, and I didn't know what to do with a wife who didn't need saving." "I never needed saving," I said. "I needed a husband who was curious about me. Those aren't the same thing, and if you spend the rest of your life confusing them, you'll do this again to someone else, whether or not it's me." He looked up. "Is there any version of this where you don't hate me?" "I don't hate you," I said, and I meant it, which surprised even me. "I'm just done being someone's assumption. If you want anything resembling a future with me, you'll have to become someone I'd choose on purpose, not someone I'm just still legally tied to out of habit." He left without another word that night, and I sat alone in my office for a long time afterward, not triumphant, not devastated, just quietly certain that whatever came next, I would be the one deciding it. I thought that boardroom and that quiet conversation after it would be the hardest thing I faced that week. I was wrong, and Do-hun made sure of it within 48 hours. By Wednesday morning, 3 separate financial news outlets had published stories questioning Calloway Crown Capital's fund performance, citing an anonymous former employee who claimed I'd inflated returns to attract institutional investors. It was garbage, every word of it, built on nothing but a doctored spreadsheet that someone had leaked to 2 reporters who should have known better than to run with it unverified. But garbage travels fast when it's timed well, and Do-hun had timed it perfectly, dropping it the same morning regulators were scheduled to review his own short-selling activity, hoping to bury his story under mine. Marcus found me at 6 a.m., laptop already open, coffee untouched. "It's not going to hold up," he said, "but it's going to be ugly for a few days while we prove it. Then we prove it in a few hours instead of a few days," I said. By 9, I'd called an emergency press briefing of my own, not at Choi Group's offices, but at Calloway Crown Capital's headquarters, on ground I controlled completely. I stood in front of my own logo, not J1's, and I opened with the actual audited numbers, verified by an outside accounting firm whose name every reporter in that room recognized on sight. My fund manages $2,940 million, I said. Every dollar of it audited annually by Kestrel and Marsh, whose report I've handed each of you this morning. The spreadsheet circulating this week isn't one of ours. It's formatted incorrectly. It uses a fiscal calendar my firm has never operated on, and it was sent to reporters from an email address registered 11 days ago, the same week my husband's cousin began facing scrutiny for stock manipulation of his own family's company. Another reporter, further back, raised her hand before anyone could continue. Miss Calloway, is it true your firm also holds a controlling stake in Winterhall Hospitality, the group that owns the venue where the gala was held? I hadn't planned to address that this morning, but there was no reason to dodge it. Yes, I said. Calloway Crown Capital acquired a controlling interest in Winterhall Hospitality 4 years ago. Choi Group has held its annual gala at a Winterhall property for the last 4 years without anyone in that family asking who actually owned it. I'd encourage everyone in this room to think about how many rooms you've stood in, assuming you understood who held the power in them without ever bothering to check. That line ended up as a pull quote in 3 separate business publications by the following morning, and I won't pretend I didn't know, saying it, that it would. What none of the reporters in that room knew yet was that Do-hun had spent the same 48 hours trying one more move before the story caught up to him. Marcus took a call that morning from one of Calloway Crown Capital's oldest institutional clients, a pension fund we'd managed for 9 years, saying they'd been approached directly by a consultant offering an exclusive early look at a rival fund's returns, with pointed questions about whether Calloway's numbers could really be trusted given recent controversy. The consultant's firm traced back, within an hour of Marcus pulling the registration records, to Ridgeline Strategic. He's trying to poach Meridian Pension while the story's still fresh enough to make people nervous, Marcus said. Then let's make sure Meridian hears the real story before he finishes telling them his version, I said. I called their investment committee myself that afternoon, walked them through the audited numbers in full, and by the end of the call the fund's director told me, almost apologetically, that Ridgeline's outreach had made a lot more sense now that we know who sent it. Do-hun didn't get the client. He got one more data point for regulators to add to the pattern building against him. A reporter in the second row, a sharp young woman from a financial daily who'd covered Choi Group for years, raised her hand. Are you saying Do-hun Choi planted this story? I'm saying the timing speaks for itself, and I'd encourage all of you to ask him directly, on the record, why a fabricated document about my fund surfaced the exact week his own trading activity came under regulatory review. Nobody needed me to say more than that. By that afternoon, 2 of the 3 outlets had issued corrections. By Friday, the story wasn't about me anymore. It was about Do-hyun and how far a man would go to protect a scheme that was already unraveling under its own weight. I want you to notice something, because it's the whole reason I'm telling you this story instead of just the version that ends at the gala. Every single time someone in that family tried to make me small again, they handed me exactly the platform I needed to prove, one more time, precisely how large I actually was. I found Se-yeon 2 days after the press briefing, not by chance. Marcus tracked her to a serviced apartment across town, the kind Do-hyun's people used when they wanted someone kept quiet and comfortable at the same time. She opened the door already knowing who I was, and didn't pretend otherwise. I figured you'd come eventually, she said. I'm not here to yell at you, I said. I want to understand what you thought you were getting out of this. She let me in. The apartment was expensive and sterile, the kind of place that looks like a life instead of holding one. Do-hun found me 2 years ago, she said. I was already working PR for the company. He didn't have to convince me of much. Jae-won barely noticed me until I made myself impossible to overlook, and by then Do-hun had already built the rest of the plan around me. Did you know he was manipulating the stock? I didn't ask, she said. I've learned not to ask questions when the answer might mean walking away from money I need. And the baby? Something flickered across her face. Quick, unguarded, the first real thing I'd seen from her since the gala. That part wasn't a plan. That part was just my life getting complicated at the worst possible time. You do know it's not his. Her jaw tightened, and for a moment she looked less like a woman running a scheme, and more like a woman who had simply run out of good options a long time before tonight. I know, she said. I was hoping I wouldn't have to know it publicly. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. You made a choice to use a pregnancy as leverage in someone else's war, Se-yeon. Whatever happens next, that part's on you, not on the timing. What do you want from me? Nothing, I said. I'm not here to threaten you or buy your silence. I came because I wanted to look you in the eye and tell you I know exactly what happened and exactly whose idea it actually was. You can spend the rest of this however you'd like. But you should know that the next time a man offers you a plan that requires you to disappear the moment it stops being useful to him, that's usually the moment to ask harder questions, not fewer. She didn't answer that. I let myself out, and it was the last conversation we ever had. Se-yeon resurfaced publicly that same week, not with an apology, but with a lawyer. Choi Group's outside counsel received a letter demanding a settlement in exchange for her silence about the full nature of her arrangement with the family. Grandmother Choi, to her credit, refused to authorize a cent of it and forwarded the letter directly to the same regulators already circling Do-hyun. What came out over the following 2 weeks was uglier than even I'd expected. Se-yeon hadn't just been paid to seduce Jae-won for the timing of a scandal. The child she was carrying, according to a paternity filing that became public record once the settlement dispute escalated into litigation, wasn't Jae-won's at all. It belonged to a junior partner at Ridgeline Strategic, the same consulting firm Do-hyun had used to run his shell company. She'd been playing two men for two different purposes, and both of them had been too convinced of their own importance to ask a single hard question along the way. By the time the paternity filing became public record, the story had stopped being mine to control at all. It moved through the city the way these things always do, mouth to mouth, faster and uglier with every retelling. I heard fragments of it everywhere. A hostess at a restaurant Marcus and I used for lunch meetings, lowering her voice to a coworker. That's her, the one who humiliated her husband at his own company gala. A woman at my dry cleaner, not realizing I was 2 feet behind her in line. I heard the mistress wasn't even carrying his baby. Can you imagine embarrassing yourself that badly in front of the entire industry? A business anchor on the financial channel Marcus kept muted in the office, captions scrolling under a photo of Jae-won looking smaller than I'd ever seen him look in 6 years of marriage. Che ay drop hair s-triptof a authority amide candle. Wife's farm held veto power 1 years. Do-hyun's name showed up in a different tone entirely. Not gossip. Headlines. Secretars, regulators, open, formal, enquiry, ento, choi drop executive. The financial press doesn't care much about affairs. It cares about fraud, and fraud was what they finally had, laid out in black and white, impossible to spin. At a dinner I attended 3 weeks later for an unrelated deal, a woman I barely knew leaned across the table and said, without any preamble, I have to say, watching you walk to that podium might be the most satisfying thing I've seen at an industry event in a decade. I didn't know how to respond to that the first time I heard a version of it. By the 5th time, I'd learned to simply say thank you and let the conversation move on, because the truth was more complicated than a satisfying moment, and I wasn't interested in performing triumph for people who hadn't lived any of the 6 years leading up to it. Grandmother Choi told me once, in one of the few honest conversations we ever had, that the industry's memory is longer than anyone wants it to be. They will talk about the gala for years, she said. Long after they've forgotten why Do-hyun's face was on the news, they'll remember that the wife everyone underestimated turned out to be the only adult in the room. I didn't know yet whether that was a compliment or simply an observation. I've decided since then that it was both, and that I've made my peace with either version being true. Jae-won found out about the paternity filing on a Tuesday afternoon, standing in Marcus's office of all places, because Marcus was the one who had the paperwork and the decency to tell him in private instead of letting him read it in a filing online. I wasn't there. I heard about it from Marcus afterward, the way Jae-won had gone very quiet, sat down without being asked, and stayed that way for almost 20 minutes. He asked me if you already knew, Marcus told me. I told him you'd have told him if you'd known. He didn't say anything else after that. I didn't feel triumphant hearing it. I want to be honest about that, because this isn't a story about enjoying someone else's collapse. I felt something closer to grief, For the 6 years I'd spent building a marriage with a man who'd never once thought to ask who I really was, and for the fact that even now, watching everything he'd built on other people's silence come apart, some small, stubborn part of me still wished it hadn't had to happen this way. 2 weeks after the gala, Choi Group held its quarterly shareholder update, the first public event since the scandal broke. I hadn't planned to attend. Grandmother Choi asked me to, in a phone call that included, for the first time in 6 years, something that sounded almost like respect. The board wants clarity, she said, about leadership, about Calloway Crown Capital's role going forward. I think it would help if you were there. Publicly, I went. I stood at the same podium where, weeks earlier, my husband had introduced his pregnant mistress to 300 people. This time, J1 stood at the side of the stage, not the center of it, and when it was his turn to speak, he did something I hadn't expected. He apologized. Not the practiced, camera-ready apology I'd have believed came from a media consultant. A real one, halting, imperfect, delivered in front of the same room that had laughed at me weeks earlier. I spent 6 years married to the most capable person in any room I ever walked into, he said. And I never once asked her what she actually did with her days, because I'd already decided the answer didn't matter as much as how she made me look standing next to her. That's on me. Not on Naomi. Not on this company. On me. Nobody laughed this time either. I didn't reach for his hand. I didn't need to. And neither did the room need me to, for the moment to land the way it needed to land. Some corrections don't require forgiveness to matter. They just require being said, publicly, by the person who owed the words. Grandmother Choi found me afterward, in the same hallway where she'd once told me to help in the back with catering. I was wrong about you, she said. I think I've been wrong about you since the day you walked into this family. You were, I agreed. But I'd rather you say it to me now than never say it at all. She was quiet for a moment, studying me in a way she hadn't before, without the practiced distance she usually kept in place. Do you know how I came into this family? She asked. I was 19. My own mother-in-law told the entire wedding party I'd only married in for the money, in front of every guest who mattered to my husband's business. I spent 40 years making sure nobody in this family ever had reason to say that about me again, and somewhere along the way, I forgot what it felt like to be the one they said it about. Until I watched myself say something almost identical to you, 3 weeks ago, in front of 300 people. That's not an excuse, I said. I'm not offering one, she said. I'm telling you I recognized what I did to you the moment I saw your face afterward, because I remembered exactly what my own face must have looked like, 40 years ago, in a ballroom very much like that one. What happens with J1? That's between him and me, I said. But whatever happens, it won't be because this family decided who I was allowed to become. That part's over. She nodded, and for the first time in 6 years, I believed she actually meant it when she said, "Good." That same week, I drove back to the hotel restaurant in Charleston where I'd waited tables 11 years earlier, the same dining room where I'd met Harold Weiss balancing a tray I could still remember the exact weight of. The restaurant had changed hands twice since then, but the woman who ran the front of house, Denise, had trained me my very first week on the job and still worked there, greying now, sharp as ever. She recognized me before I said a word, wiped her hands on her apron, and pulled me into a hug that smelled like the same coffee and candle wax I remembered from being 22 years old and certain I'd be doing this job for the rest of my life. I saw the story, she said. Girl, I showed everybody back here. Told them. That's the same one who used to work the Thursday brunch shift and cry in the walk-in when the tips were bad. I remember that walk-in, I said. You were the only server who ever actually listened to the guests instead of just nodding along, she said. I used to tell you that'd matter someday. Guess I was right. You were, I said. I don't think I've thanked you properly. For any of it. You don't owe me thanks, she said. Just don't forget what carrying the tray felt like. Seems like plenty of folks who make it out forget that part first. I sat at the same corner table where I used to eat my break meal standing up, because sitting down never felt like it was allowed. And I ordered the same thing I used to eat for free on slow nights, and for 20 minutes, I wasn't the woman who'd just ended an empire in front of 300 people. I was just someone Denise had trained, eating lunch in the restaurant that taught her everything she needed to know, long before anyone in the Choi family ever learned her name. Do-hyun's case moved into federal review for securities fraud tied to the short-selling scheme within the month, and Choi Group's board voted unanimously to permanently exclude him from any leadership position, present or future, regardless of the review's outcome. Choi Group's stock, once the scandal cleared and the real numbers came out clean, climbed higher within the quarter than it had ever traded under Jae-won's sole leadership, buoyed by investor confidence in a board that had finally been forced to grow real oversight instead of family loyalty dressed up as governance. Jae-won took a junior operations role in the logistics division, the same division Do-hyun had run, and by every account I got from people who had no reason to flatter him to me, he worked it like a man trying to prove something to himself more than to anyone watching. No title handed to him. No wife standing silently at his side, covering for whatever he decided to do next. 6 months after the gala, I stood in that same ballroom for a different event, a smaller one, a dinner for Calloway Crown Capital's newest fund launch, held on my own terms, under my own name, with my own guest list. Jae-won was there, not as my husband performing a role for cameras, as a guest who'd asked to come, and whom I'd decided, after 6 months of watching him actually change instead of merely apologizing, I wanted in the room. He found me near the same champagne fountain, in a different dress, no borrowed pin this time, just a plain gold bracelet I'd bought myself the week I closed my very first deal, 11 years earlier. "I don't expect anything," he said. "I just wanted to see the room you actually built." "It's not finished," I said. "I'm still building it. I'd like to watch, if you'll let me." "From wherever you decide, I've earned a seat." I didn't answer right away. Some things don't need an immediate answer. I let the silence sit exactly as long as it needed to, the same way I'd let that ballroom silence sit weeks earlier, right before I proved every single person in it catastrophically wrong about who I was. "We'll see," I said finally, and for the first time since the night he brought his pregnant mistress to my party, I meant it as an actual possibility, and not just a door I was leaving open out of habit. A year after the gala, Calloway Crown Capital closed its largest fund to date, $4 billion, anchored by 2 of the same pension funds that had quietly backed me since the earliest years, long before anyone in the Choi family knew my name. Holden Pacific's Robert Sung became one of my board's independent advisors. Winston Hale, the board member who'd murmured waitress into his drink at the gala, sent a handwritten apology that Marcus keeps framed in the break room as a joke, though I suspect he's only half joking. Do-hyun's securities case settled that spring, a fine large enough to be called historic by 2 different financial papers, alongside a permanent bar from serving as an officer or director of any public company. He left the city not long after. I heard, second-hand, that he'd moved into private consulting somewhere quieter, the kind of work men do when they've run out of family names willing to lend them credibility. Jae-won stayed in the logistics division for the full year and earned, on his own, a promotion the board voted on without a single mention of his family name in the discussion, according to Marcus, who sat in on it. I watched that vote from the outside, curious in spite of myself, and felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Something like respect, tentative and unproven, but real. Marcus and I sat in my office late one night that same week, the 2 of us, the last ones in the building, the way we'd been 100 times over 11 years, and he poured us both a drink he didn't usually bother pouring. 11 years, he said. "You remember the office before this one? The one with the space heater that only worked if you kicked it? I remember you kicking it every morning like it was part of your job description. It was," he said, "along with pretending I believed you when you said a $40,000 seed check from a retired stranger was definitely going to become something. I didn't believe you, for what it's worth. Not at first. When did you start?" "Somewhere around year 3, when you turned that 40,000 into your first 8 figures and didn't even seem surprised by it." I remember thinking, this woman has been waiting her entire life for someone to hand her a real chance, and the second she got one, she acted like she'd known all along exactly what she'd do with it. "I had," I said. "I just hadn't had the chance yet to prove it." He raised his glass, and I raised mine, and for a moment neither of us said anything else, because 11 years of quiet, unglamorous work doesn't always need a speech to be honored properly. Sometimes it just needs someone in the room who remembers the space heater. A journalist doing a retrospective piece on the gala asked me, on the 1-year anniversary, what I'd tell other women who'd spent years being underestimated by people who should have known better. "Let them underestimate you," I told her. Every single person who ever laughed at me in that ballroom handed me a stage I hadn't even asked for. The mistake people make is thinking being underestimated is a wound. It's an opportunity, if you've actually spent the years building something worth revealing. She asked if I regretted staying married as long as I had, given everything that came out afterward. No, I said, and meant it. I regret staying quiet about who I was for as long as I did. Not because I owed anyone that information. Because I let a room full of people believe a smaller version of me was the whole truth. And some nights, I think I was the one who believed it hardest. If there's one thing I'd want you to take from a night that started with my husband parading his pregnant mistress in front of 300 people, it's this. The moment someone decides you're small enough to humiliate in public is very often the exact moment you have the most power to prove them catastrophically wrong. I didn't raise my voice that night. I didn't cry, and I didn't beg for an explanation I already knew wasn't coming. I just walked to the podium and I signed my name. Diane Marsh, the columnist who'd laughed into her napkin about where I came from, wrote a very different column a year later, one that opened with the line, "There is exactly one lesson the Choi family gala taught the entire industry, and it has nothing to do with marriages. It is this. Never assume you know the full balance sheet of the person standing quietly next to power. Sometimes she is the power, and has simply been waiting for the right moment to say so." I keep a printed copy of that one in my desk drawer, not out of vanity, but as a reminder of exactly how far a room's assumptions can travel in either direction once you decide to stop managing them for everyone else's comfort. If this story meant something to you, hit subscribe, because there's a lot more where this came from, and drop a comment telling me which moment hit hardest. I read every single one.